Eu tenho 2 canais de YouTube, o José Maio Path de Episteme, que é dedicado a trazer grandes intelectuais internacionais, e o José Maio Jornada Episteme, que tenta trazer intelectuais nacionais também para a internet. E agora, com vocês, a palavra do Felipe.
Oi, gente, prazer, eu sou o Felipe Oliveira, é um prazer imenso estar aqui. Eu sou graduando em História pela USP e atualmente eu conduzo uma pesquisa em História Intelectual dentro da História Moderna, então é um prazer em especial estar aqui hoje.
Bom, pessoal, como eu já mencionei, né, a PUC e a USP colaboraram com esse evento. Eu gostaria de agradecer especialmente o meu amigo o João, que fez a ponte com a PUC, e o Daniel, que ajudou a USP, o departamento da USP também a entrar nessa parceria.
Bom, legal. E hoje a gente tem o imenso prazer, como vocês já devem ter visto, de entrevistar o professor, historiador, pesquisador e escritor Quentin Skinner.
Bom, pessoal, é meio estranho eu apresentar o Quentin Skinner, né? Mas vamos lá, né? O professor Quentin Skinner, ele é membro da Academia Britânica. Atualmente, ele é professor emérito de Humanidades da Queen Mary University of London, onde é membro desde 2008. Foi professor régio de História de Cambridge University até 2008, onde esteve desde 1959. Lá em Cambridge, ele completou o seu BI em 1962 e o seu MA em 1965. Além disso, ele também passou pelo Institute for Advanced Study em Princeton e pela Austrian National University e pelo Collège de France e pela Universidade de Harvard, entre outras instituições.
Bom, desde a década de 1960, o Skinner publicou diversos livros, coletâneas, artigos em revistas, e com pelo menos 7 de seus livros já foram traduzidos para o português. Ele também é muito conhecido dentro da história intelectual, especialmente dentro do estudo de história moderna, por conta como a figura principal da metodologia, que ficou conhecida como a Escola de Cambridge, ou contextualismo linguístico. E é bom a gente pontuar que esse evento aqui em específico, ele diz respeito ao recente lançamento do Skinner, o livro Liberty as Independence, publicado pela Cambridge University Press, agora no início desse ano de 2025.
O pessoal, de modo conciso, assim, como é que vai funcionar? Eu e o Felipe, a gente elaborou em umas 11 questões para o professor Skinner. No final, se a durabilidade é de 1 hora e meia. Se no final sobrar espaço, teremos 2 questões para o público geral. Caso não, a gente vai, o Felipe vai informar vocês como é que vai funcionar lá no final da entrevista.
Mas podem ir elaborando as questões ao longo disso.
Professor Quentin Skinner, it's an honor having you here.
Well, thank you very much, Jose and Felipe. It is an honor and pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm most grateful to you for organizing this event. And special thanks to all of you for allowing me to speak in my own language. This is a privilege that Anglophones, above all, must never take for granted. So thank you all, grazie a tutti, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor G.
Obrigado.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I echo José's words here. And I also like to reaffirm what a pleasure it is to have you here with us. So let's go directly to our first question.
Thank you.
Okay. Professor Quentin Skinner, what intellectual currents and historical consciences completed you to delve into the evolution of Western political thought? Sorry.
Well, the intellectual currents by which I was most influenced when I first started graduate work, that was in 1962, this was very local, and not just local to the United Kingdom, but local to the University of Cambridge, where, as you say, I just finished my studies. There were two major figures there studying political theory and intellectual history, Peter Laslett and John Pocock, who had just left the university to go back to New Zealand, but they had both at that time published what became classic monographs on Anglophone political theory in the early modern period. In 1957, John Pocock had published his book, The Ancient Constitution, in which he showed how, or this is how I read it, he showed us how the writing of history could be a form of political theory. And that was an insight that greatly influenced my own earliest research. And then in 1960, Peter Laslett published his edition, a critical edition of John Locke's two treatises on government, which is, of course, a classic text in Anglophone political theory. Now, Laslett managed to unearth the exact political circumstances that prompted Locke to write. And so he showed us a great deal more about that text than had ever been understood since Locke's contemporaries. And what both those works enabled me to see was that the then prevailing way of writing in the Anglophone style about political philosophy was far too narrow and I think probably misguided. We were told, I was told as a student, that the way to proceed was to select one of the major Anglophone texts, I mean Hobbes, Locke, Bentham, Mill, so on, and see if that had anything to contribute to our contemporary discussions of the fundamental questions. I mean, freedom, rights, sovereignty, political obligation, and so on. Now, it was Pocock's work and Laslett's work that persuaded me that if it's worth trying to understand, shall we say, a philosopher like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, what you have to try to do is to place them in their own historical setting, and hence to see what motivated them to write as they did. So in a word, I agreed that the study of political philosophy needed to be, as Laslett would have said, or indeed Pocock, completely historicized. And I immediately began to write in that idiom. So there's my thought.
Professor Skinner, what is the significance of linguistic philosophy in the shape the methodologies you employ your works, particularly in the relation to the interpretation of history, text, and political thought?
Well, there were two philosophers by whom I was deeply influenced when I was first starting out, both philosophers of language, and one was Wittgenstein, and the other was J.L. Austin. I was most of all influenced as a young scholar by Wittgenstein. I think we all were in Cambridge. He'd been the great Cambridge philosopher of that generation. And in his philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein says, towards the end, words are also deeds. So that what we have to understand is that language is a form of social action. And he adds in the same paragraph that it might be a matter of great complexity to understand what specific action is being performed. And the general claim I took away from that famous passage was that if you want to understand anything that has been said, what you have to recover is what the speaker or writer was doing. Think of it as action. What were they doing in saying what they said? Actually, Wittgenstein makes that point at the very beginning of the investigations. He says, what you have to understand is the Sprachspielen in play. Now, that word Sprachspielen was mistranslated in the English version of the philosophical investigations as language games. But as Austin noticed, Sprachspielen, we ought to speak of speech performances. That's to say, what is being enacted here? What is the writer doing? And Austin, picking up from this point, and as far as I can see, by the way, Austin is just echoing Wittgenstein. He says you must focus on speech acts to recognize that to grasp the use of a concept involves understanding what it is for, what can be done with it. And that requires you to understand not just the meaning of the terms that are used to express the concept, but also the specific context of their use. And it is only from understanding that context of use that you can identify the speech performances. So these were the Wittgensteinian considerations that led me to argue that the project of attempting to interpret any utterance has got to proceed historically. You've got to re-enter a completely different intellectual and socio-political world in which the individual text constituted some kind of intervention in some existing debate. You've got to go in that way if you're going to have any prospect of understanding them. Actually, I went on to suggest myself that a further point we want to make is what kind of interventions are these texts, these political texts, going to be making in moral and political philosophy? And I suggested that, roughly speaking, you can expect that any such intervention is going to either be to do with upholding or else challenging some existing moral or political commitment. So of any text, what you ought to be asking is, what's it supporting? What's it trying to vindicate? Or what's it attacking? What's it criticizing? What is it maybe polemically ignoring in relation to existing political values or institutions or practices?
Okay, that's great. So my third question comes from something that really intrigued me while I was reading your new book. In a footnote right on the first page of Liberty as Independence, you clarify your use of certain terms. Among them, you write that generally speaking, you use freedom as a synonym for liberty,
Yeah.
following the non-differentiated approach already adopted by Isaiah Berlin in his Two Concepts of Liberty. In light of that, my question is, after the publication of the book, do you still believe there is no conceptual difference between these two terms? Could you explain why you chose to treat them as synonyms right from the outset?
Oh, very interesting. Well, that's a question for an etymologist as much as for a political philosopher. But as you indicate, that is a question that keeps coming up in the Anglophone literature. So let me see if I can answer it. I think the crucial point for me here is that the sources that I drew on in my book, and the sources on which the Anglophone writers I talk about are mostly using are classical, and they are above all Roman texts, Roman historians, Roman moralists, and above all Roman law. Now, I'm examining the view of what they always called libertas in the Roman historians and in the jurists. Libertas is always the noun they use. So there's the noun, libertas. But what about the adjective? Now, when the Roman legal writers talk about people who possess liberty, that's to say, by contrast with the figure of the slave, what the slave lacks is libertas. When they're talking about the person who possesses libertas, the adjective they always use is they say that this is a homo liber, a liber homo. And that's, of course, how you find it in all the Romance languages. I mean, think, for example, of Italian. I mean, that speaks of libertà, but also of the uomo libero. However, English is a Teutonic language as well as a Romance language. I mean, it just, because of its history, it just puts these two together. Now, the noun in modern English from libertas is liberty, but the adjective is free from frei. I mean, that's the Teutonic source. But that's all there is to it. I don't see any substantive philosophical difference between talking about freedom and being free, Freiheit and frei, and speaking about liberty, libertas, or being a free person, liber. It's just that in English, I don't know why this is so, but the English, unlike Italian or French, I don't know about Spanish and Portuguese, but they did not take the classical route. They took the Teutonic route. And so you get freedom as well as liberty. But they're used synonymously, except that in English, if you want the adjective, you have to say free. We just don't have liber there. So that's why I don't think anything of philosophical significance is involved.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Quentin Skinner, is the Republic concept of liberty distinct from liberty as independence? Inside that question, how does Roman intellectual tradition shape your view of liberty, your new book, especially in the relation to development of the Republic ideal? What role did Roman legal tradition play in the shape the concept of liberty as independence?
Yes, well, let me try to answer these questions in turn. First, you ask, is the Republican concept of liberty distinct from liberty as independence? Okay, very important to me. As far as I can see, everyone who wrote in Anglophone political theory from the perspective of being a Republican, that's to say someone hostile to monarchical regimes, everyone believed that the liberty of subjects consists in not being subject to any exercise of arbitrary power, and hence in having an independent will. Now, that is the view of all the early English Republican writers. They emerged to prominence in the 17th century. Names that won't probably be important to you, James Harrington, Algernon Sidney, but a name that you will no doubt know, John Milton, one of our greatest poets, but also one of the greatest English Republican writers of the 17th century. This is the view that all of them take of liberty. So you could say all Republicans believe that liberty is independence, but it would be a huge mistake to suppose that the idea of liberty of independence is only used by Republicans, which of course is what Philip Pettit originally claimed. The fact is that in the Anglophone tradition, many of the most celebrated exponents of the idea of liberty as independence, for example, John Locke, were not Republicans at all. He would be horrified if you'd called him a Republican. So all Republicans speak of liberty as independence, but a great number of radical writers who are absolutely not Republicans also speak of liberty as independence. So that's what I would say to that. Now, yeah, you also ask, what role did Roman intellectual traditions, and especially Roman law, play in shaping the concept of liberty as independence? Well, I'm especially pleased that you ask that, because I've come to think that it's the contribution of the Roman legal tradition which is paramount. It's absolutely vital. So let me say a word about libertas and the liber homo in Roman law. It all comes in the digest of Roman law. All of this, of course, is from the early 6th century, when Roman law was finally systematized under the Emperor Justinian, and you get something called the digesta, the digest of Roman law. Now, the digest says law is about persons, so we've got to start by asking about what is a person. And here the jurist immediately invoked, Gaius, says, actually, he says something rather amazing. He says, almost all persons are either men or women, but there are intermediate cases. I mean, that's quite amazing, really, isn't it? Because that's still kind of contested in our society. But anyway, most people are either men or women, and all men and women are either free or else they are slaves. Okay, you can be liber or you can be a servus. You can have libertas or servitudo. So what does it mean to be a slave? Florentinus is then cited. Slavery, he says, is a feature of the jus gentium, by which everyone is. This is contrary to nature, but it's part of the jus gentium, contrary to jus naturale, but part of jus gentium, that someone is subjected to the power of somebody else. Subjectus. However, and now another jurist is cited here, the converse does not hold. That's to say, you could be subject to the power of somebody else without being a slave. For example, children are subject to their parents, but they're not slaves. People in need of wardship are subject to the discretion of their ward, but they're not slaves. So we're being warned, notice this, that being subject to arbitrary power can't be the definition of slavery. although, of course, that is the definition that you find the Roman moralists and the historians using. Cicero and Livy use it, for example, but the lawyers refuse it. So the lawyers are left asking, well, if being subject to arbitrary power can't be the definition of a slave, what is the definition of a slave? And then this is a vital moment, but it's very obvious. They say, well, what it means to be a slave is that you are owned by someone. You're somebody's property. Now, I just want to add one thing to this because it's very important historically. It happens that when Roman law was taken over into the Anglophone tradition, which it was at a very early stage in the 13th century, in an immense compilation of the English laws, De Legibus Angliae, that section that I've been talking about now from the digest was missed out. So for most English writers on the liberty of subjects, they take it that what defines slavery is subjection to arbitrary power. And that remained the usual definition of Anglophone political writers throughout the era of the Enlightenment, right up to the time in the late 18th century when abolitionism became a very important movement, the abolition of slavery as an institution and, of course, as a trade. Because then what they started to say was, well, actually what's crucial about slaves is they may be subject to someone's power, but the crucial point is that they're just chattels, they're just property, somebody owns them. So I think that's what I want to say about Roman law, that it's absolutely pivotal to the whole discussion.
Great answer, Professor Skinner. Professor Skinner, what was the impact of the American and the French revolutions on both Western political thought and the concept of liberty as independence? Why did these revolutions pave the way from a shift from liberty as independence to liberty as absence of constraint? Constraint is difficult. Word in Portuguese.
Yes. No, very well, very good. Okay, well, this historically, this is an absolutely vital question. I would say the revolution in the British colonies in North America, and this is what I argue in my book, was probably the most important cause of the shift away from thinking of liberty as independence, independence of subjection, and towards thinking of liberty simply as absence of restraint, coercive restraint or physical restraint. And I would want to say you can pinpoint this quite exactly. And the year would be 1764. That was the year after the end of the first great international war waged on both sides of the Atlantic, the 7 Years' War, so-called. That was brought to a close in 1763. But the cost of waging a war on two continents had meant that the British national debt had grown enormously, so much so that in 1764, the new government has to think of new ways of raising funds. And the British Parliament decided, and this was the first time they'd ever done this, that they would impose direct taxation on the American colonies. Now that produced an extremely hostile response immediately from the earliest American revolutionary writers, James Otis, who was a Boston lawyer, Stephen Hopkins, who was the governor of one of the colonies, it was Rhode Island, and John Dickinson, a lawyer from Philadelphia. They all basically make the same case. And this is what they're all saying. Taxation in Britain is never, ever imposed without consent of Parliament. Never has been. And the reason is that if it's imposed by mere command, the resulting law confronts the citizens simply as an exercise of arbitrary power. No one's consent has been asked for it. But they then want to say to be subject to arbitrary power is what it means to be a slave. It means that you've been deprived of your liberty. So they're enslaving us. So this tax must not be paid. Now, the British government at first attempted to impose its will by force, and a war breaks out. But after a year of warfare, the colonists declare that they will continue to fight until they have freed themselves entirely from the arbitrary power of the British Crown. And they make that declaration in July 1776. And of course, what do they call it? The Declaration of Independence. That's what they are insisting is their due, sorry. Now, that final move, the Declaration of Independence, was enthusiastically supported by radicals in England, especially Thomas Paine, Richard Price, and others. But it produced a tremendous backlash. So a host of pamphleteers, some famous, some not, but including Jeremy Bentham, for example, come forward to say, look, this whole story of revolution in independence is based on a misunderstanding of the concept of liberty. Civil and political liberty is not a matter of whether or not you are independent of arbitrary power. And these writers draw on a long anti-democratic tradition in European political thinking. I mean, one of the earliest figures to articulate a contrary view of liberty is actually an English writer, I mean, Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, and it's very much taken up in the absolutisms of continental Europe, especially through Pufendorf and his host of disciples. And all of them want to say that no one is deprived of their liberty if they're merely liable to interference, liable to taxation. And although it's true that actual interference takes away liberty, that will sometimes be indispensable in a crisis, and it is for the government to decide. So what you find is there's a kind of absolutist reaction, which includes the dismissal of the claim that the American Declaration of Independence is a declaration of anything to do with liberty, because liberty is only not being stopped from doing something. Well, there's nothing, when the English are not stopping them from doing anything, they're simply legislating, and they have a sovereign right to do so. So there is how, among British writers, the idea of liberty as independence suddenly came under tremendous pressure. Now, to answer your question about the French Revolution, I can do so very briefly, because 10 years later, of course, revolution breaks out in 1789 in France, also as an attack on the alleged despotism of the monarchy, and thus an attack on absolute monarchical power in the name of the freedom of the French people. But in England, of course, they panicked, because they saw revolution as coming to England, and above all, what they wanted to do in the face of the French Revolution, think of Edmund Burke and all the conservative writers who followed him, was to denounce the French Revolution. And it was usually denounced because it had completely misunderstood the concept of political liberty. Political liberty is not being independent of arbitrary power. Political liberty is not being restrained. So it happens very suddenly, very dramatically, and it's the revolutions that do it.
Professor Skinner, I have a classical question, moral philosophy and political philosophy.
So I'm not quite understanding your question.
I'm sorry, José, acho que sua câmera travou.
Voltou?
Oi, voltou. Pode falar.
Voltou? Sorry, guys. Discuss about the concept of liberty and well-being fall into the relationship between liberty and power. What is the relationship between liberty and power, especially regarding the transition from the ancient world to the modern one?
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, no, I understand. Okay. Well, as I've been saying, there are two rival ways of thinking about freedom or liberty. I mean, I want to be able to say both in the Anglophone philosophical tradition, just to pick up your point about the tradition. And one view, nowadays dominant, is that it's just absence of constraint. So on that analysis, the relationship between freedom and power is that to be at liberty is to be free from any exercise of directing power over us, and hence free from being stopped from doing what you want to do. So freedom is absence of constraint due to the power of anyone else. So that's a relationship of freedom and power. There's a power to restrain. As long as you're not restrained, you're free. But the other view I've talked about, the one that used to be dominant and is only now, I think, in my generation being revived, thinks of freedom not as absence of restraint, but you could say absence of the possibility of restraint. So the relationship of freedom to power here is that you are free only if no one has the power to interfere and intervene. It's not that you're unfree if they do, it's that you're unfree if they could. It's an extraordinarily important distinction. And that view is the classical one. And I do not think that that view was actually much challenged until the early modern period by the absolutist writers whom I've talked about. So yeah, now I think about it, I like that way of making the distinction. You could think of freedom as in relation to power, that freedom is absence of interference by a power. And the alternative view is that freedom is absence of the possibility of interference by that power. Yeah, so that's it, yeah.
Great. So, Professor Skinner, the next question is something that I always wanted to ask you.
Oh, yes, good.
In a field of intellectual history, you are especially well known for your methodology, the linguistic contextualism, also referred as the Cambridge School. In 1969, you published the article Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, which was later revised and republished in 2002 in your volume 1 of your book, Visions of Politics. This article has been and continues to be one of the most widely read and discussed pieces within the field of contextualism. When applying this method to closely related themes, liberty as independence is inevitably compared to The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, published in 2 volumes in 1978, and also to Liberty Before Liberalism from 1998. Given this context, my question is a request for self-assessment. How do you view the changes in your method over these past 50 years? Do you believe there have been significant shifts or adaptations in the way you approach intellectual history since your 1978 book?
Wow, well, there has been one major shift in my views about historical method since I published that essay, which you kind of refer to, Meaning and Understanding, in 1969. Much the most cited of any essay I've ever published, although I strongly regret some of what I say there. Now, in that essay, I was opposing the view that the history of political theory should be studied simply as a body of classic texts which were thought to contain sort of timeless wisdom from which we can all hope to benefit by studying them. I wanted to insist on the pastness of the past and not to pretend that the classic texts can provide answers to contemporary problems. I was insistent on the very obvious point that they're not answering our problems, they're answering their own problems, and we'd better try to answer our problems. Now, I remember that's exactly what I said, but I now feel that that separated past from present far too much. And for a long time, by contrast, I've become quite long ago especially interested in what you might describe as paths not taken in the history of moral and political philosophy. And I've tried to show that although some views about concepts that are still central to our moral and political understanding have been indeed revised or indeed abandoned, that is true of many, we ought not to assume that the path that was not taken would indeed have been the wrong path. Maybe it was we who were wrong. Maybe the past contains more fruitful answers to some present questions than we're inclined to believe. So I'm not looking at continuity. I'm looking at what might be important for us in discontinuity. So let me give some examples just to clarify. I've discussed that possibility in relation to the abandonment of an historicized understanding of fundamental rights in favor of what we do nowadays, which is we talk about human rights. Now, was this change from talking about fundamental rights of particular societies where the rights are the product of time and experience, is that view of how to think about rights inferior to the view that we can simply say we all have human rights, that's to say obligations that everybody can say they have over everybody else, and everyone has a duty to follow them? So I actually think that the concept of human rights needs to be re-examined, and that the other traditions should be reconsidered. I mean, the difficulty with our discussions of human rights is that it expands. I mean, you can't stop it expanding into a list of everything that would be nice. And these lists can begin to look ridiculous. I mean, for example, in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, it's a human right that everyone has 2 weeks of paid holiday in a year. Well, I mean, there are parts of the world in which it just makes no sense to talk like that. I mean, what's the point of saying it's a right? It's not ever going to be, under circumstances that we now have, fulfilled. So maybe we want to think of rights more particularly to particular social formations. I thought that's worth asking. I also talked about paths not taken in relation to the concept of the state. In current discussions in political philosophy, as you all know, the state is just taken to be the name of an apparatus of power. And some states have more power and some states have less, but what distinguishes a state is what power it has, sort of Weberian understanding. I think there would be much benefit in reviving the original view of the state, which is that it's the name of a person. It's a distinct person. It's a fictive person. It's got to be represented, but it is a person. And think about the implications of state personhood. Now, again, in my present book, I've tried to do this again, and I've talked about paths not taken in relation to the concept of liberty. The path we didn't take was that liberty is independence. We took the path that says liberty is just absence of restraint. Is that a moral and a political improvement? The whole point of my book is to say no, it's not. The path not taken is the path we should take. So there is a very radical reconsideration on my part of potential relations of the history of moral and political philosophy to contemporary moral and political philosophy.
Yeah, great answer. That's something I really wanted to
Well, thank you, Felipe.
So the next question has been written by the USP professor of early modern history, Daniel Gomes de Carvalho, who's my mentor and who is a specialist in Thomas Paine. So I'll be doing it since he wasn't able to attend here today. In the afterword to the classic The Machiavellian Moment from 1975, written by your recently deceased colleague John Pocock, he writes that Thomas Paine was not truly a Republican, but rather someone who simply hated monarchy. In your new book, you present Paine as a central figure in the late defense of the liberty as independence. How do you see the relationship between Paine and Republican thought, especially when comparing your new work with Pocock's approach?
Well, that's a really important question. And I'm sorry that Professor Gomez can't be here, because I'm very glad to be asked about John Pocock and his approach to the study of Republican thought, especially as John Pocock was a great mentor to me and a great friend. And his Machiavellian Moment is is, as you know, in Anglophone literature, it is now a classic work. Well, now, John Pocock, as you say, saw Paine basically as a hater of monarchy. And that seems to me absolutely right. That is what really motivated Paine, his hatred for hereditary institutions of all kinds, because they were anti-democratic. His insistence that all power should be with the people, so there can't be any power in a monarchy because it's opposed to the power of the people. So yes, I think John is basically absolutely right that Paine is fundamentally a hater of monarchy, at least in his original treatise Common Sense, 1776, which is what John Pocock is talking about. It isn't quite so clear later, but anyway, he's definitely right about that text, where the whole of Paine's point is to support the American colonists by denouncing what he sees as the tyranny of the British king, George III. However, as the question says, John Pocock did not think of Paine as a Republican. And that, if I may say so about so great a historian as John Pocock, that seems to me a big mistake. If you turn to Paine's Rights of Man, which I don't think John did, you find a ringing affirmation of the claim endorsed by all Republican writers that liberty must be understood as self-rule, independent of any other power. So liberty's independence is a fundamental tenet for Paine. So here's an interesting question, I think. Why did John Pocock insist that, as was rightly put, Paine was not truly a Republican? Now, I think the answer lies in John Pocock's understanding of what it means to uphold a Republican view of liberty. John always insisted that what liberty meant to Republicans, now this is his understanding of what republicanism means. By being a Republican, you take a particular view of liberty. The particular view of liberty you take is that liberty means living a life of virtuous civil action. So that's John Pocock's view. It's almost like reading Hannah Arendt. And he, in the end, said that. And he describes himself in one of his late works as an Arendtian about freedom. That's to say, he's someone who thinks that when we say liberty, what we mean is living a virtuous life of civic action, having it in you to do what brings out the best in you, in the way that Arendt thought about it. That is how to think about liberty. Now, I do not myself think that any Republican writer throughout the period I discuss in my book ever argued that liberty means a life of virtuous public action. Some of them think that what liberty requires is that citizens should contribute to political life rather than being ruled by arbitrary power. But when they ask themselves, but what does liberty mean? It means not being subject to arbitrary power. That's what it means. The kind of power that is that tyrants and despots wield once public participation in politics has been made impossible. So I have to say that I don't think John Pocock really grasped the view of Republican liberty held by the 18th century writers, including Paine. But I should say, John and I argued about this for decades. And almost the last letter I received from John was still saying to me, I just don't understand why you think this notion of independence matters. So the truth is that neither John nor I ever managed to change the view of the other.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much.
Great answer, Professor Skinner. Thank you so much.
I'll ask just a moment now. That I'll open the chat for our audience questions. Ok, Professor Skinner, I'll talk in Portuguese now.
Okay.
Bom, então, gente, espero que vocês estejam gostando da entrevista. Nesse momento, eu vou abrir o chat para vocês, para que vocês possam mandar mensagem diretamente para a gente, para os hosts. E as mensagens de vocês vão ser de perguntas. E a gente pede para nas perguntas vocês se identificarem de quais institutos vocês são, se vocês são alunos, são professores, e se vocês têm como falar essa pergunta em inglês, diretamente para o Skinner, abrir o microfone e falar ela. Então, vocês podem mandar diretamente para a gente no chat. A gente vai dar uma olhada nas questões e vai selecionar algumas. A gente está esperando pelo menos 2 questões. Se der tempo, a gente coloca mais questões. A gente também vai aceitar as questões do YouTube, de quem está vendo a live agora. Para quem está vendo a live, alguém da PUC-RS vai mandar essas questões para a gente no chat também, as questões que estão vindo do YouTube que forem interessantes para a gente falar aqui. Tá bom, gente? Vou voltar agora e passar a palavra para o José de novo.
Thank you, Felipe. So guys, our next question will be conducted by the PUC-RS Professor Nitamar de Oliveira. So first my question, after Nitamar. So, Professor Skinner, how does
Yeah.
your conception
By the way, I didn't understand anything that's just been said.
sorry.
That-
I used the nervous, sorry.
Okay,
Professor
no, go on. You have some more questions for me. Yes, please go on.
Okay, thank you so much. Professor Skinner, how does your conception of liberty as independence different from Philip Perez's notion of liberty as not domination, particularly regarding the rule of power, interference, and political loyalty?
Well, I'm very glad to be asked about Philip Pettit. He and I have talked about this ever since we did a seminar together on it in 1994. And we've both been trying to think about it ever since. I owe a great deal to Pettit. And I would say, in answer to your question, that I do not think that Philip and I differ very much at all. But Philip likes to look at the concept of liberty more from the perspective of people holding power, who may be said to take away the freedom of others. And so that's why he likes to talk about domination and non-domination. The question is there a dominating figure? If so, you're unfree. If there's no domination, that's what freedom is. Now, I myself prefer to think about the same concept of liberty, from the perspective of those who are dominated. So I prefer to talk about freedom of absence of subjection to the will, and specifically the arbitrary and hence uncontrolled will of others. So he wants to talk about domination. I want to talk about subjection. Now, if you ask, well, why do I prefer to talk about liberty as non-subjection rather than non-domination? My answer is that that's how they talked. They hardly ever talk about domination. I mean, I find one use of the word dominatio in Salles' history. I find it hardly ever used in the classical sources, and certainly not in the legal sources. They always talk about subjection, what it is to be free, by contrast with what it is to be a slave. So for them, it's the figure of the slave that keeps being crucial, not the figure of the master, the dominus. So I'm simply using the vocabulary that my sources use. And as for your further point here, the difference between Philip's account and mine in relation to the concept of interference and loyalty, I need first to say that neither of us focuses on the concept of loyalty. We're both much more concerned with the kind of domination and subjection that might be said to compel loyalty. But we don't directly address questions about loyalty, except that to say, as Philip does, that of course domination is a way to command loyalty. But as for interference in relation to liberty, Philip and I both say the same thing. we both want this sharp distinction between the view of liberty that sees it as absence of interference or constraint and the view of liberty that Philip and I essentially share, which is that liberty is to be understood as absence of, and then you can either say domination or subjection. They mean the same, they're seen from the opposite view. You could say this: we both think that liberty is an absence not of interference, but an absence of the possibility of interference. That's a huge conceptual divide that then opens up. Some people have said to us, well, you know, it doesn't seem to be so different from the idea of interference. And there's just recently been some reviews of my book by the Liberty Foundation people who are rather cross with me. And I would want to say, they want to say, well, they're really not so different, these two views. I would want to say they are there's a huge gulf that divides them. It's all the difference between not actually being constrained and there not being a possibility of being constrained. That is a very large difference. So thank you very much for the question. It's making me rather heated, as you can see.
Sorry, guys, modern language. Professor Nitamara, gostaria de fazer essa questão?
Só um momento, professor Nitamar, eu pedi para você se desmutar. Ai, pronto.
Yes, you unmute. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Skinner, once again for your generous attention and availability, sharing your thoughts with us. Even though you've just addressed many issues relating to your highly original distinction between liberty as independence and liberty as domination, I'm still asking you this question. In one of your major monographs, Liberty Before Liberalism, from 1999, you mention Philippe Petit as, a quote, the most powerful advocate of the new Roman theory among contemporary political philosophers, unquote. If I understood your conception of the state correctly, you seem to counter Petit's contrast of negative liberty as absence of interference, as you just said, say, in liberalism, as opposed to freedom as absence of dominance, thinking of the Republican tradition, in order to dismiss the former and make a case for the latter within the historical context of social institutions and their legal political arrangements. Now, since both you and Petit seem to be defending the Republican notion of negative freedom as non-domination, my question is, how do you ultimately place arbitrary power and non-arbitrary interference vis-a-vis offense against negative freedom insofar as they turn out to be source of non-freedom? I'm thinking here especially of women, LGBTQ citizens and legal residents in the US today who have their individual liberties, sexuality, and reproductive rights threatened by the Trump administration. It seems that in this case, both liberal and Republican views have been challenged, especially what was called equal liberty, meaning that in a constitutional democracy, freedom should be equally shared by all. So how would you respond to this situation as we see it happening right now in the US? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. This is extremely important, and I'm most grateful. Thank you very much for being here also, Professor. Well, I think the difference between arbitrary and non-arbitrary interference is an extremely important one. And the sort of non-arbitrary interference that the writers I'm discussing, they most of all consider in relation to law. Now, law is interference, but it's not arbitrary interference, although it undoubtedly restrains our liberty. Now, in relation to that, in relation, for example, to changes in the law that you're describing at the moment, the writers I'm interested in would, I think, have two things to say. First, if you're living in a free state in which the laws are made by the people, at least by representative, and not just by diktat or executive order, then you will have consented to the laws that restrict your liberty. So you don't have any ground for complaint about the resulting restriction in that constitutional case. However, I absolutely see your point. There is really a problem here for the ideal of liberty as independence, because, even if we set aside the Trump regime for a moment, even in a democracy in which the represented will of the people is the source of all law, that it's not just diktat or executive orders, it is very unlikely that that's going to be the will of all the people. It's going to be a majority will. But that's to say that there are going to be minorities, as you indicate, which will not now find themselves confronted by a law to which they've consented. They will find that they're confronted by a law to which they have not consented, and thus they're confronted by an arbitrary power. Now, that, of course, is the question that Rousseau thinks that he can solve with the concept of the general will. But if Rousseau does not convince you, and he certainly does not convince me, then there is indeed a problem here for the Republican theory of liberty, just as you intimate. I absolutely take that point. But the second point I'd like to bring out in relation to this question is that the view of liberty as independence also says that the question of how far your freedom of a citizen as a citizen is restricted by law is not really what matters. This is the best defense that the Republican is going to be able to give. What matters is, are you a free person? And this brings out the relationship to what you're saying about, for example, very bad marital relationships, which are cases in which women are often subject to the arbitrary will and power of somebody else. So why do you think, why do they think, why does the Republican think that that's what really matters? And I think the answer is this. If you are a free person, not in that condition, then it's true that nevertheless, sometimes you will be prevented from acting as you wish because your action would be contrary to law. But if you are living in subjection to somebody's arbitrary power, be it a partner or the whole state, then you are never going to be able to act as you wish, because all your actions, if you're really in a state of subjection, will be the product not merely of your own will, but of the permission of the person who could take the permission away. And in that case, the traditional Republican argument says, well, then you're a slave. That's what it means to be a slave. And perhaps that is the Republican answer to the question I've raised. But very good. Thank you so much for raising these issues.
Yeah, great. So now we're getting into our final scripted question. And then we're going to the audience questions, right? So my last question for you is, here at the University of São Paulo, your work has had a strong impact, especially in the courses taught by professors Alberto Barros in philosophy, Eunice Ostrensky in political science, and in history, Modesto Florenzano and Daniel Gomes de Carvalho, my mentor, just to name a few. It is worth mentioning that both Eunice and Modesto have held a discussion have translated some of her works into Portuguese, and have translated some of her works into Portuguese. Continuing that tradition, in 2023, you had a discussion with students from the USP Law School.
Yes, yes.
USP is not a unique case of your influence. In Argentina, we can point to the work of Professor Elias Palti as example, as an example.
Yeah.
How do you view the reception and impacts of your academic work in Brazil and in Latin America more broadly?
Well, I'm very glad of the chance to say how grateful I am for the extremely generous reception of my work in Brazil. As you say, I had an online discussion with students at USP 2 years ago, and it's very good to be back online and getting these further, to me, extremely interesting questions. Well, there is one thing which I would like to say about me and Brazil, which is that thinking about today, I looked up through my publisher details about the translations of my books. I've published 12 monographs, and of those, 8 have been translated into Portuguese, which makes Portuguese the most translations I have received in any language. So thank you all very much. If you don't keep up, you're going to be overtaken by China. But I think that's true of all of us, you know.
Yeah.
May I say, I'm especially pleased to be able to underline what you say about Professor Ostremski. Perhaps I shouldn't pick anyone out in particular, but she has contributed so greatly to my being published in Portuguese. And I'm proud to add that I've known Professor Ostremski for a long time, both as a major scholar in my subject and also as a friend. And indeed, I had lunch with her in the British Library only a few months ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. It's an honor to read all your books in Portuguese. So now getting into our audience questions. Okay. I think we can start with Professor João Jung. If that's okay. Hey.
Hello, everyone. Can you listen me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Professor Skinner, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for your kindness in accepting the invitation, sharing your work with us. It's a true honor to engage directly with you in this moment. So, Professor Skinner, I am professor of international relations in PUC. So I will take a little bit of this influence to this question. That is, and before yesterday, Professor Joseph Nye left us, one of the biggest liberal in the theory of international relations. So it's a kind of a sadness, but here we can talk about some ideas of him and make a conversation. About your book, and I had the pleasure to receive your book and read your book, Liberty as Independence. Thank you for your kindness in sent it to me and to Professor and to José. My question, Professor Skinner, is, and I read it right now. In your book, you argue that true liberty consists in the absence of subjection to arbitrary power. That is, liberty as a political status of independence. Based on this conception, how would you assess the position of peripheral states in the contemporary international system, especially given their structural dependence on international financial institutions, great powers, and globalized flows of capital? Would it be reasonable to claim that such states, despite their formal sovereignty, are in fact unfree in the Republican sense you propose? Thank you very much, Professor Skinner.
Well, thank you, because this seems to me extremely important issue to raise, and I'm very glad to have it put center stage in this way, because I would want to say, and I would love to know what you would feel about this response, that the theory that I wish to, the theories I wish to promote, the idea that liberty is a state of independence from arbitrary power, applies to states as much as it does to individuals, at least in principle. The freedom of a state will be undermined if it is in a relationship to another state, which is one of dependence upon its goodwill. Because there are then a great number of things that the dependent state is not going to feel able to do. I mean, if it is dependent on another state, as many poor countries are in the world at the moment, if it's dependent on the charity of another state, then it will have to be very polite and cautious. If the other state is investing in it, it's going to have to be ready to give special priority to that state, to say, well, yes, you can come and have our minerals, but nobody else can. I mean, they're going to be put in a position where it's going to be very difficult not to give favors. And all of this is not because there's any active interference. The loss of liberty that's involved here, liberty to decide who should mine, liberty to decide where your charity should come from, stems not from any active interference by the other state, but simply by being so subject to it. And so I think the point you're making is one that I would like to see very much more emphasized in international relations. I think we're unduly polite to major states, which place poor states in conditions that the Republicans would describe as the enslavement of that state. It is a kind of colonialism that's still being practiced. That's what they would want to say.
Perfect, Professor Skinner. Thank you very much. We have a lot to think about it, so we are very pleased. Thank you very much for your answer.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so our next question will be conducted by Vinicius Ochoa, who is a master's student at Unicamp, UNECAMP. So, okay.
Professor Skinner, it's a pleasure to you listen. Do you listen?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a pleasure here to talk about your great influence in my work, in my formation, especially in my recent research about Charles Dickens and the terror in the French Revolution in an intellectual history perspective. My question to you, Professor, is that if you agree with the intellectual historian Antoine Luthier in his book L'Héritage des Lumières, Ambivalências da Modernidade, traduzido em português, Luthier, in that book, arguments that the old opposition between intellectual history and social history became obsolete, that this is no more distinction into these two fields. I wanted to hear about if you agree with Luthier and what you think about the difference between intellectual history and social history. Because in my university, in my field, there is some difficulty in look about the intellectual history and the contact with other fields of the history, cultural, social, political.
Yeah, yes. Very
so
good.
That's my question. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting to me, because these boundaries are porous and they're very difficult to make very precise. I would say myself that to claim that the distinction between intellectual history and social history is an obsolete distinction, I see the point and I partly agree with it, but I think that's certainly an exaggeration, because there are questions that intellectual historians ask, which social historians do not ask. Usually these would be detailed questions about the exegesis of texts, which are much more philosophical enterprise. And on the other hand, there are questions that social historians ask, which intellectual historians tend not to ask, as, for example, the impact of economic change upon political theory. So I think it's a rather general answer that I'm giving you, but it's a very important question, especially to students who are starting out. And I always try to say to students at that stage, well, don't give yourself a label. Give yourself a topic, and then you will find out if the topic turns out to be, as I would want to say, wholly intellectual history. I mean, suppose you want to give an account of the exact context in which a text was written. That's not going to be primarily a work of social history, but some social history might enter into it. And that might be true of the social historian with intellectual history as well. So I think what I would want to say, I do say to students, is keep an open mind on this distinction. But don't pressurize yourself by the thought that there may not be a distinction, because you're not necessarily under an obligation to write intellectual history if you're a social historian.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so our next question, and I think probably because of time deal, it'll be our last. It'll be made by Guilherme Gefter, who is my colleague and friend at USP. I'll ask him to unmute. Just a moment.
Oh, I don't see a picture here.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, certainly. We can even see you.
Oh, great. Sorry. I had to turn my camera off because this computer is not plugged in, so the battery will be drained out quickly. First of all, thanks, Professor, once again for the wonderful interview you've been giving. I can assure you most of us here have been greatly influenced by your work, and I can also assure that myself, as a historian, have contended with your works for many months now, almost uninterruptedly. So it's been really important for me. So there's a question I would like to ask that came up to me precisely during this interview. So in regards to method, earlier in this conversation, you contended that an aspect between the relationship between past and present can be found in discontinuity. So you said, for example, that the Republican ideals of liberty have been sort of discarded, and you think of the paths not taken. But I would also like to ask you if you can find some aspects of this relationship in continuity. So, for example, ideas that have prevailed and that have influenced you, and because they have influenced you as a historian, you are now writing about them. So, something like that.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting. Look, I mean, we're all Marxists to the extent that we believe that social being creates consciousness, and my consciousness is created by my social being. And so there are going to be important continuities. My worry was that in my original work, I was underestimating continuities, but I still have a slight suspicion, at least of the traditional idea, that what you need to do with the classic texts is to make them answer our questions. Some of them are quite good at answering some of our questions. And I would say that that would have to be a second point I should have made more in the original essay that was being discussed. And I think certainly that might be true in questions about the theory of justice, where, of course, contemporary discussions have drawn very heavily on historical discussions, but where there are continuities there, and they have proved to be quite fruitful. So I wouldn't want to set it aside. I do want, however, to say that if you concentrate on inquiring into the usefulness of the past from thinking the opposite, which is, well, you know, we really don't think like that at the moment. So, for example, the very interesting question raised about state relations and the relationship of this view of freedom to international relations, that's something which is not a continuity and it's very little discussed, but it needs to be discussed. And so that would have been, if I'd thought about it, and then, of course, the questioner brought the point out brilliantly, is that that's a further case where there's a path not taken, which I would want to say, just speaking at the end blankly as a moralist, ought to have been taken. Just as I felt in answering Professor Zubairan that there are paths there in contemporary social theory that have not been taken, but they ought to be taken in a society that is more concerned with equality and justice.
Okay, that's fine. Professor, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, just about.
Yeah. So, quick question before our ending. And this question will be done by the professor of UFF, Luis Falcão. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself.
I see him, yes.
Okay.
Hello, hello. All right.
We're listening to you.
So I'm very glad here, Professor Skinner. It's a pleasure and an honor. I would like to say that your last book translated here in Brazil, Visions of Politics, this one.
Oh, yes. Well, that's very recent.
I was one of the translators of this book.
Ah.
So I would like to ask you, in other tests, you have said that the word neo-Roman is more adequate than Republican or neo-Republican to say about liberty, but you accepted this use of Republican. Now, I would like to ask you, with liberty as independence, can you replace the Roman or Republican difference? Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see, let me think. Well, but while I'm trying to think, wonderful to meet one of my translators. This rarely happens, but of course, one never gets a chance to express one's proper gratitude. It is, after all, with a language as widely used as Portuguese, it is the introduction to an enormous room which is otherwise closed off to me. And so I'm extremely grateful. Obrigado. I don't want to talk about republicanism, and that's because the view of freedom that I'm talking about doesn't commit you to being a Republican, and it never was thought to commit you. It does, however, commit you to having a certain view about government, and that would be that since anyone who hasn't consented to a law is confronted by an arbitrary power, and since that is an enslaving thing to happen to you, what the neo-Roman story requires of you is not a republic, but it certainly requires something like a democracy. It requires a form of government. And that form of government must be one in which, at least by representation, the will of the people can be made to be what the law is. Now, that contrasts very strongly with the idea of freedom as non-constraint, which is indifferent to the source of law, because it's not interested in the source of law, it's interested in the extent of law. And that's a very standard liberal position. And it's exactly the position taken up by Isaiah Berlin in his famous Two Concepts of Liberty, where he says there's just no conceptual connection between liberty and forms of government. And especially, he wants to say, not between liberty and democracy. And he goes so far as to say you could easily be far more free under an enlightened despotism than under a democracy. Now, that is what I want to be refuted. And I'm not quite sure of the best terminology in which to offer the refutation, but it is that the Republican or neo-Roman, or whatever we want to call it, view is highly sensitive to forms of government. because if it can be shown, as it can be easily under an enlightened despotism, that it may be enlightened, but it's still a despotism. And as one of the great English Republicans, James Harrington, said in his reply to Thomas Hobbes, you are forgetting that whereas in a democracy you are the owner of yourself and you are the owner of your property, under a despotism you are only a tenant of your property, and you are, as he brilliantly puts it, you're only a tenant of your head. You can lose that equally easily simply by the arbitrary will of someone who cannot be gainsaid. So what I want in the way of naming is to capture that insistence of the neo-Roman or Republican view. I don't want to call it either of those, but I don't have a name for it as a result. Nobody wants neo-Roman, although, of course, as I've shown this afternoon, I think it is neo-Roman, but it's not just neo-Roman, obviously. I mean, we've been adding to it and thinking about different cases. But at the level of nomenclature, I think what we've got to come back to is the implications of the fact that what we're talking about is not being subject to arbitrary power. And that's my whole story, really. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, so now I'll pass the word to José, who is going to enter in our closing.
Okay, thank you so much, Felipe, Quentin Skinner. Now, before going to our concluding remarks, I would like to thank some of the support of this event. Firstly, I would like to thank the Cambridge Universe Press for sending me beforehand that Skinner possibly magnus ops. I would like also to thank the PPG of History and Philosophy of PUC-RS, especially Nitamar, Anelise, and Renata.
Okay, I'd also like to thank the place where I study, the Department of History at USP, and especially, again, my mentor, Daniel Gomes de Carvalho, who I know isn't here today, but is listening to us, and for all his support and assistance in preparing all this presentation. I also want to thank José, obviously, for co-hosting here by my side. It has been great.
Thank you again. I'd like to thank Professor Daniel and Professor and my friend João Henrique Salles and Felipe for co-hosting this presentation. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to give a warm thank to Professor Quentin Skinner from so clearly agreeing to give this interview. I truly inspiration this interview. Thank you so much, Professor Quentin Skinner.
Yeah, and I echo José's words and thank Professor Quentin for coming here. It's been a great pleasure, and also want to thank for all his works that have in many ways shaped a lot of my academic aspirations.
Well, thank you all. I just want to draw to a close myself by thanking everyone who has been involved this afternoon, as well as everyone who has organized this occasion. I must say, so efficiently and so generously. And I've greatly enjoyed the afternoon, and I've also learned a lot. So warmest thanks to you all, and very best wishes to you all for your academic enterprises too. Obrigado.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Bom, pessoal, agora em português, queria agradecer a todos que participaram, a USP, a PUC-RS e todas as universidades que estiveram aqui junto num momento bonito de compartilhar o conhecimento com um grande intelectual quanto Quentin Skinner. E eu agradeço demasiadamente a todos vocês. Foi emocionante. Muito obrigado a todos que compareceram.
Valeu, gente. Eu acho que o evento deu muito certo. Professor, I hope you have liked the event. I think it went really great. And we thank you very, very much for coming here today.
Thank you, thank you. And
Thank you, everyone.
farewell, but not goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bom, Felipe, acho que deu tudo certo. Fiquei super nervoso, mas deu tudo certo.
Deu tudo certo.
Obrigado, cara.
Valeu, cara. Valeu.